Today we're going to learn about a vaccine being invented. A lot of you have heard lately about the coronavirus, the pandemic that is going all around the world. By the way, what a pandemic is pan means world. So if it's in at least 3 different parts of the world where they have a sickness that's getting out of control, is very contagious, we call that a pandemic. If it's only in one area, we might call it an epidemic. But at any rate, when we don't want to get a disease, when it's very dangerous for us to get it, scientists will start to work on something called a vaccine. And they are working very hard to try to come up with a vaccine for the coronavirus. Just like when you've gotten shots at the doctor, you've gotten maybe a flu vaccine. Sometimes you can even get that in your nose. You may have gotten a chickenpox vaccine. Or you might have heard it called varicella. Chickenpox was something that was around when I was a child. Everybody got it. But once you got it once, your body fought against it and you had immunity. And that's what the vaccine does. It gives you just enough to help you not get sick, but to tell your body, give it a message to fight it off and to build something called antibodies. Anti means against. So it's building things to fight against the virus. So once you have a vaccine, you're supposed to not be able to get the virus again or the sickness again. This book right here is called Edward Jenner and the Smallpox Vaccine. Smallpox was eradicated, I think, before I was born. We'll have to check the dates in the book. But it used to be a big problem. So let's find out what this story is about. It's by Linda Ross, illustrated by Renee Daly. There's pictures right there. Okay. Edward Jenner left the world a better place than he found it. In 1796, oh, that's a long time before I was born. In 1796, he developed the first vaccine to protect people against smallpox. At that time, smallpox was a disease that killed many people. Edward's path to finding the vaccine was not an easy one. He worked very hard, and he began his work at a young age. Wonder how young he was. Let's see. Edward Jenner was born on May 17th, 1749 in Berkeley, England. He was the youngest of 6 children. Edward's mother and father died when Edward was young. Edward went to live with his older brother, Stephen. As Edward grew, both he and Stephen thought about what Edward should do for a living. So Stephen's the older one, and here's Edward. Finally they agreed that Edward should become a doctor. Back then, training for a career began very early. At the age of 13, Edward became an apprentice, or student helper, to a doctor. Daniel Ludlow was a good country doctor. Edward proved to be a very good student. He worked with Ludlow for about 7 years. Edward learned a great deal from him. So if he was 13 when he started, and there were 7 years passed, he would be 20. That's still pretty young. That's usually about your 2nd year of college. One day, Edward and Ludlow talked to a young girl who worked on a farm. She had always been told that she could never get smallpox because she already had cowpox. Cowpox was a disease that farm workers got from cows. It was not dangerous the way smallpox was. Edward listened carefully to what the girl said. He thought about it. Could someone who had had cowpox be protected against smallpox? At age 21, Edward had finished his work with Ludlow. He continued his training in a city hospital. In London, he worked with the famous doctor John Hunter. John Hunter was a great teacher. He taught Edward always to question the facts and to carry out many experiments. Edward worked with him for about 2 years. He and Hunter became good friends. Still, Edward missed country life. In 1773, he returned to Berkeley to work on his own as a doctor. Edward soon became known as a very fine doctor. All this time, Edward never forgot what the young girl said about cowpox. He wanted to study the subject. Could cowpox protect against someone against smallpox? Edward spent years studying cases of people who had cowpox. He visited dairy farms. He took notes on the way that cowpox made people sick. He became an expert on the subject. Edward was busy with his work. In 1788, he married Catherine Kingscote. They later had 2 sons and a daughter. Even as his family grew, Edward kept studying cowpox and smallpox. So this was years and years and years of studying. Edward wanted to test the idea that cowpox could protect people from smallpox. In May of 1796, Edward had the chance. A farm worker named Sarah Nelms had cowpox. Edward took some fluid from the sore on her hand. Then he injected it into the arm of James Phipps, a healthy boy. The boy's parents had agreed to let him take part in the experiment. You may have heard a term, clinical trials, and that's kind of like what this experiment is. Edward chose James because he had never had smallpox or cowpox. Edward was sure that his idea would work. He did not believe he was risking the boy's life. James' parents were scared. Still, they trusted Edward. They knew that James could get smallpox if they did nothing. It's pretty brave. They have no idea what's going to happen. James became sick with cowpox. His body made antibodies to fight it. In a few days, James was fine. Then Edward injected smallpox into the boy's arm. He didn't get sick. The antibodies that fought the cowpox fought the smallpox too. During the next 2 years, Edward tried this experiment many times. All the results were successful. In 1798, he wrote a book about his work. At first, many people doubted Edward. Some people even thought that if they got cowpox, they would act like a cow. By the early 1800s, many British doctors agreed with Edward. In 1804, 12,000 British people were vaccinated against smallpox. The word vaccine came from vacca, the Latin word for cow. Well, that's interesting. Edward's experiment took place more than 200 years ago. Science has made a great deal of progress since then. Today, scientists would think of Edward's experiment as risky. Modern scientists do not run tests on people until they have run tests in controlled settings. Edward died in 1823. Now the world is free of smallpox. We can thank Edward Jenner for that.